Hey everyone, AJ here from Whole Latte Love, and I want to take a minute to talk about coffee storage and freshness. It's a highly debated topic in the home brewing world. Everyone wants their coffee or espresso to taste fresh, but what does fresh mean? Are your beans really the best right after they're roasted? And how long do they last before they're no longer good? To answer some of these questions, let's take a look back at an experiment I performed examining how time and different storage methods affected espresso extraction. The results may not be exactly what you'd expect. But before we jump into that, a quick reminder that Black Friday and Cyber Monday deals are going on now at Whole Latte Love, featuring the best selection of coffee and espresso equipment available. I'll put a link down in the video description to the sales page for you to check out after the video. And if you're watching this replayed later, you can still use that same link to see all of the current sales going on. Now, on to that video. How to keep coffee beans fresh, a 30-day espresso experiment. If you talk to most coffee experts, they'll tell you that the age of your beans has a huge effect on the end product in your cup. But how important is it really to use fresh beans? Hi everyone, AJ here from Whole Latte Love, and I'm running an experiment to test the effects of time and different storage methods on coffee beans when being used for espresso. Here I have a fresh 5-pound bag of Fuego Coffee Roasters Ethiopia, only 5 days from roast. This is a high-altitude Yirgacheffe coffee grown at 1,800 to 2,200 meters. Starting today, I'm going to see how these beans age over the next 30 days when left in this bag, stored in an airtight container, or put in the freezer. I'll be evaluating how this time period changes extraction time, appearance, and taste. So, let's get started. On day 1 of the experiment, I opened the bag and immediately set aside some of the beans in an airtight container with a release valve to allow gases to escape. This would stay sealed for the duration of the 30 days and serve as a control for the experiment. I also measured out 15 individual doses of 18 grams each and put them in the freezer. The rest of my beans would stay in the original roaster's bag. This is not ideal storage in the real world, but for the sake of this testing, I was hoping it would highlight or even expedite the effects of aging. The goal here is consistency. I chose all of my equipment with that in mind in order to minimize variables in extraction. By single dosing with the Chiato E37 SD grinder, I would ensure there were no leftover grounds from the previous day affecting my results. Using Osso Coffee's The Jack Leveler would provide consistent distribution and compression without inconsistencies in tamping pressure or technique. I chose to use an ECM Synchronica with PID temperature control, again to ensure consistency from shot to shot. Shots would be pulled in a temperature-controlled room at the same time of day, hoping to minimize even slight variation in humidity or other factors that may affect the results. To check the retention on my grinder, I measured 18 grams of whole beans using an Acaia Pearl scale. I did 1 small squirt of water with my RDT sprayer to moisten the beans and control static, then grinded. I measured my output at 18 grams, essentially 0 retention. I repeated this a few times, always with plus or minus 0.1 gram, which is an acceptable tolerance for these tests. I used an Acaia lunar scale on my drip tray, set to start a timer when it registered the first drops of liquid. I wanted to dial in a 2-to-1 brew ratio of 18 grams in, 36 grams out in 25 seconds from first drip. My first shot was way too fast. I adjusted my grind finer and pulled another one. Closer, but now a little too slow. After a couple more shots and adjustments, everything checked out. I stirred my glass, took a sip, and noted the dose, time, and taste in my extraction log. This would serve as my reference point for the rest of the experiment, so I pulled 2 more shots just to make sure I was right on with my grind size. Lastly, I taped off my quickset gear knob so I wouldn't accidentally change it at any point. My past experiences led me to believe that as beans age and when keeping the same dose, you generally have to grind finer to get the same extraction time. Because I wanted to quantify this change, I decided to leave my grinder untouched at this initial grind setting for the duration of the experiment and measure the difference in time it takes to get that 18 grams in, 36 grams out, or as close to 36 as I could eyeball while manually shutting off the pump. To make this more clear, I'll freeze frame each shot right at 36 grams. Every day for the month, I pulled a shot with this same technique. After each shot, I noted the time and taste. Right off the bat, the results were not what I expected. I anticipated the extraction would get faster and faster as the days went on. Instead, the first few days were wildly inconsistent. First 25 seconds, then 41, then 26, then 53. For the next week, the time actually increased, indicating that my grind was too fine, even though I hadn't changed anything. At this point, I started to worry that I was going to choke the machine and ruin the entire experiment. But after day 10, things started to turn a corner and my extraction times began steadily decreasing again. You may notice that on day 15, my background starts looking different. With the COVID-19 pandemic ramping up in the middle of filming this video, I took my entire setup out of the office and recreated it at home. For the next week, shot times were faster, falling between 30 and 35 seconds, and the large, inconsistent swings I experienced early on stabilized. The last 9 days of testing resulted in a steady, consistent decrease in extraction time, essentially what I had expected from the start. This graph shows the extraction time versus bean age based on my results. You can clearly see that the first half of the month was much less consistent than the second. There was a clear point when my extraction time turned a corner and started decreasing, at which point variances shrunk and shots became more consistent for the rest of the month. As for appearance, nothing earth-shattering to report. Here's a photo of all 30 shots for comparison. Small variations throughout the month were likely due in large part to the differences in extraction rather than the age having a direct impact on the appearance. That said, here's days 1 and 30 side by side. The crema on the first shot has noticeably more depth and color compared to the older beans. This makes sense considering that fresh roasted beans retain a large amount of CO2 before continuing to degas as time goes on. The last thing I noted throughout my experiment was taste. These results should be taken with a huge grain of salt for several reasons. Most importantly, shots that are so improperly dialed in, such as the days I was pulling minute-plus extractions, are going to taste wildly different than if those same beans had been extracted properly. Additionally, different roasts and batches will behave differently, so these results only relate to my specific test. On day 1 of the experiment, the espresso was very bright, acidic, and sour, almost overpowering, which is to be expected from beans that fresh. As the first week went on, some of that sourness started to fade away and was replaced by tastes of sweet, fruity, and tangy. On day 10, I noted my first hints of bitterness, though this ended up also being my longest shot, so I'll attribute that largely to over-extraction. As my extraction time started to come back down, that sourness started returning in the form of sharp, tart flavors. On day 16, I wrote down, "Best shot yet. Great balance of brightness and full-bodied flavor." As my extractions continued to stabilize, some of the early flavors returned, bright, tangy, grapefruit. Over the next week, the acidity toned down and I felt like I was drinking a more balanced and enjoyable, less overpowering, version of those first few days. Come day 28, the fruit flavor faded a bit and remained that way for the last 3 days of tasting. In summary, the taste varied widely throughout the month, but seemed to be tied more to the extraction time than the age of the beans. From a subjective standpoint, my favorite shots were pulled in days 21 to 27. The flavor profiles these days seem the most mature and balanced without being overwhelming. In this experiment with these particular beans, 1 month was not long enough to make the espresso taste old or stale even when stored in the original paper bag. So, what about those other storage methods? I revisited the beans I had set aside in the beginning, which had remained sealed or frozen for the last 30 days. I first wanted to see how, without adjusting my grinder, their extraction time compared to my bagged beans. That evening, I took my frozen beans out to thaw but left the bags sealed. I left 2 bags still in the freezer to test grinding them while still frozen. The next morning, I started with my frozen and thawed beans. With all other factors identical to the rest of the experiment, I pulled 2 shots, both in 36 seconds. Keeping in mind my paper-bagged beans were at 27 seconds the day before, something was definitely different. Looking back at the graph, this informal test potentially places the beans at the same level as around either days 2 to 4, day 16, or day 22. Regardless, it appears that the freezer did something to slow the aging. I stirred and sipped, noting that the taste was very sour, reminiscent of the first few days of the experiment, which led me to believe that they were closer to those early intersection points. Next up was the still frozen beans. Some people claim that grinding frozen beans allows the beans to shatter in a way that results in more consistent particle size and distribution in your portafilter. I don't know how much I buy into that, but I pulled 2 shots of frozen beans anyway. The extractions came in at 36 and 32 seconds and tasted identical to the frozen and thawed shots. Lastly, the airtight container. 2 more shots, 36 seconds and 37 seconds, essentially the same time as the frozen and thawed beans. The taste was similar, but better balanced than the frozen, with acidity toned down to a tolerable level. The very last part of the experiment was to stop comparing apples to oranges when it came to taste. For the first time in a month, I changed my grinder adjustment knob. I dialed in my 3 different storage type samples back to my ideal brew ratio and time, and compared the taste of all 3. This much more closely resembles a real-world scenario of keeping your grind dialed in for your current beans and conditions, and where the taste could be accurately compared. The bag beans tasted about the same as at the end of the experiment, which makes sense considering the tests ended with a 27-second extraction time, only 2 seconds slower. The beans from the airtight container tasted incredible. Rich, balanced. I could really taste those sweet, tropical fruit flavors that I've come to expect from this coffee, and it was clearly the best shot I had the entire month. Last up was the frozen and thawed beans. While it didn't taste vastly different from the previous shot, it was still a bit too bright for my liking. Advocates of freezing coffee note that the cold temperatures slow the rate of CO2 degassing and oxidation within the beans. While this may be helpful for storage that's much longer than my month experiment, it didn't do much for me in this test. One reason for this may have been that I put my beans in the freezer too early before they had a chance to sufficiently degas, so they got locked in at that premature, overly sour stage before flavors could fully develop. To sum this entire thing up in very broad terms, here are a few key takeaways. Number 1, keep dialing in your grind. Don't just set it and forget it. Especially with fresher coffees, the variation from day to day or even within a single day is enough to throw off your entire extraction and flavor. The chemistry of the beans is changing dramatically as they degas and stabilize in the first couple weeks. During this time, you may experience more fluctuation than normal and go through more coffee dialing into your specific parameters. If you're using slightly older beans, this may not be as much of an issue. You'll just have to keep an eye on your shot time and make micro adjustments to your grinder as you go, likely toward a finer setting. Number 2, age isn't everything. Even with a specialty coffee from a micro roaster that's intended to be used fresh, the best shot I had was a properly dialed in extraction 31 days from roast. Compare that to a bean blend from a commercial roaster, and those sealed bags can typically stay good for many months without going stale. Number 3, don't stress over storage. The biggest enemies of coffee are air, moisture, heat, and light. While I wouldn't leave my beans out in an open bag for an extended period of time, you're generally going to be fine keeping smaller quantities sealed in a roaster's bag with a one-way valve in a controlled environment. If you want to be a little more thorough, get an airtight container and store the beans in a cool, dark place. For long-term storage, more than a couple months, the freezer may be your best bet. However, I would personally let the beans rest for a few days to a week after the roast date before putting them in the freezer. This will allow them to degas and lock in their flavor closer to their peak. Number 4, taste is subjective. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to coffee. While I preferred the espresso shots that I pulled in the 3rd week of my experiment, somebody else would surely prefer those in the 1st week or even the 4th. Each palate is unique, and there's no right or wrong when it comes to taste preference. Get to know your equipment, your roasts, and your own taste preferences, and find a storage and brewing method that suits you. This may take some time and experimentation of your own, but isn't that part of the fun of home brewing? This process answered some questions, but also leaves the door open for more experiments, such as longer time periods or different roasts. If you have an idea for something you'd like to see us test out, leave a comment below, subscribe, and you may see it in a future video. Until then, thanks for watching, and be sure to come back for more of the best on everything coffee, brought to you by Whole Latte Love.